The dust had not even settled on Margaret Brenner's boots when she realized, with a sinking feeling that started somewhere behind her sternum and worked its way down to her stomach, that she was standing at the entirely wrong gate. It was the summer of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle stretched out in every direction like a bolt of sun-bleached canvas that God had unrolled and forgotten to hem. The heat was the kind that made mirages shimmer on the horizon, the kind that turned the scrubby mesquite trees into twisted silhouettes and baked the red clay earth into something that crumbled like old bread beneath a person's heel. Margaret had traveled 3 days by stagecoach from Abilene, Kansas, having arrived there by train from Chicago, having arrived in Chicago from Boston, having left Boston because her uncle had written her a letter that said, simply and without much ceremony, that a good man needed a good woman, and the man in question had agreed to provide board, a fair wage for household keeping, and the possibility of something more permanent if the arrangement suited all parties. The man's name, according to the letter, was Robert Winslow of the Winslow Ranch just outside the town of Cutter Creek, Texas. Margaret had not agreed to anything romantic outright. She was 24 years old, possessed of dark auburn hair and green eyes that her mother had always called too direct for a lady, and she had very specific opinions about dust, about heat, and about men who wrote letters through intermediaries rather than presenting themselves in person. But Boston had grown difficult after her father passed, and her uncle's letter had represented something her current life in a rented room above a milliner's shop had not, which was the possibility of forward motion. So she had packed 2 trunks, endured the train, survived the stagecoach with its rocking madness and fellow passengers who smelled of tobacco and old wool, and arrived in Cutter Creek, Texas on a Tuesday afternoon in late June of 1878, ready to meet a man named Robert Winslow. The problem was that the sign on the gate she was currently standing before did not say Winslow Ranch. It said, in rough letters burned into a wide plank of cedar, Winslow. Which was, she reasoned, close enough to be confusing. The wagon driver who had brought her out from Cutter Creek, a weathered old man named Hector who talked only about the price of cattle and had opinions about every fence post they passed, had pointed at this gate and said, "That's the Winslow place, ma'am," and then had driven away before she could ask a single clarifying question. Margaret stood with her 2 trunks at her feet and the Texas sun hammering down on her traveling bonnet and looked at the gate, and then looked at the long dirt road that wound past it toward a cluster of buildings about a quarter-mile distant, and then looked back at the gate, and then decided that since she had come all this way, she was not going to let a potentially missing word stop her. She was not a woman who stopped for things like that. She pulled open the gate, picked up the smaller of her 2 trunks, dragged it through, went back for the larger one, dragged that through as well, and then walked up the road in the full blazing heat of the afternoon with a trunk in each hand and her bonnet threatening to slide off the back of her head with every step. The ranch, as it came into view, was a working operation. She could see that immediately. There were horses in a corral to the left, fine-looking animals with deep chests and intelligent eyes. There was a long bunkhouse set back from the main house, and the sound of hammering coming from somewhere behind it. The main house itself was made of limestone and rough timber, 2 stories, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and a chimney at each end. It was not fancy, but it was solid. Someone had planted a row of cottonwood trees along the eastern side, young trees that were doing their best in the heat. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall, slightly ragged but clearly tended. Margaret set her trunks down at the base of the porch steps and straightened up, pressing one hand to the small of her back, and that was when the door opened. The man who came out was not what she had imagined from her uncle's letter. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from years of actual physical labor rather than any particular ambition toward them. He had dark hair that needed cutting badly, curling at the back of his neck under the brim of a battered brown hat. He was in the process of settling onto his head as he came through the door. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least 4 days and brown eyes the color of good saddle leather that went wide with surprise the moment they landed on Margaret. He stopped on the porch and looked at her. She looked back at him. "Help you," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with that particular Texas drawl that stretched vowels into something approaching music. "I am looking for Robert Winslow," Margaret said. "I was told this was the Winslow Ranch." The man's expression did something complicated. He came down one step and then stopped, resting his hand on the porch rail. "There's a Robert Winslow," he said slowly, "but his ranch is about 9 miles east of here. His place is called the Double W." Margaret felt the sinking feeling return, worse than before. "And this ranch," she said carefully, "is not the Double W. No, ma'am, this is just the Winslow." "And you are Ralph Winslow," he said. He had the good grace to look genuinely sorry about this fact. "Robert's my cousin. We don't share the land, but we share the name, and apparently we share the problem of people mixing us up, because that has happened more times than you'd think in a county of this size." Margaret pressed her lips together very firmly and looked out at the gate, which was now a 1/4 mile away and might as well have been on the moon because her trunks were here, and she was here, and it was 100 degrees, and she had been traveling for 3 days. "The driver," she said, with a precision that she hoped conveyed the full depth of her frustration without requiring her to raise her voice, "told me this was the Winslow place." "Both places are the Winslow place," Ralph said. "That's the trouble." He paused. "I'm sorry, I truly am. Can I ask what business you had with Robert?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. He seemed solid. He seemed honest. He had the kind of face that did not appear to be hiding anything, which was the sort of assessment her mother would have said she made too quickly, and her own experience confirmed was usually right. "I came from Boston," she said. "Your cousin Robert, through a mutual acquaintance, wrote to inquire about a housekeeping arrangement, with the possibility of a more permanent arrangement if the situation was agreeable." Ralph Winslow stared at her. Then he took his hat off and pressed it against his chest and looked down at it, and when he looked back up at her, his expression had gone through about 3 different things very quickly, and had landed somewhere that looked remarkably like careful restraint. "Robert," he said, "got married in April." The silence that followed this statement was long enough to hear 2 blue jays arguing in the cottonwoods and the distant sound of that hammering from behind the bunkhouse. "He got married," Margaret said, "to a woman from San Antonio. Her name is Clara. She's expecting in November." Margaret turned very slowly and looked at the gate again. Then she turned back. "Well," she said, "that is quite something." "Yes, ma'am," Ralph agreed with a sincerity that suggested he was arriving along with her at the full appreciation of the absurdity of the situation. "I don't suppose," Margaret said, "that Cutter Creek has a decent hotel." Ralph put his hat back on his head. "It has a hotel," he said, with the specific careful tone of a man who has been asked to describe something truthfully without being unkind. "I could drive you into town. But it's 4 hours round trip and I just got the horses settled." Margaret looked at the sky. The sun was beginning its long descent toward the western horizon, but it was nowhere near setting. The temperature had not dropped by a single degree. "Miss," Ralph started. "Brenner," she said. "Margaret Brenner." He said it back quietly as if tasting the shape of it. "Margaret Brenner." Then, with the expression of a man making a decision that surprised him slightly even as he made it, he said, "The guest room is made up. It's not anything fancy, but it's clean. You could stay tonight, and I'll drive you into town in the morning when it's cooler. Or we could send word to Robert and see if he can come sort this out himself, since it was his letter that brought you here." Margaret considered this. She considered it with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, weighing the temperature and the distance and the fact that her feet were genuinely aching, and that this man, whatever else he was a Winslow, which was the name she had come to find, and his ranch was clean, and the horses in the corral looked well kept. which said something about a person's character in her experience. "That is very kind of you," she said. "I would accept, but I want to be clear about something." "I imagine you have several things you'd like to be clear about," Ralph said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was the possibility of one. "I am not a woman who is easily made uncomfortable," Margaret said, "but I am also not a woman who ignores propriety for convenience. Is there anyone else on this property who could serve as a reasonable chaperone for the evening?" Ralph thought about this. "My cook, Della. She's 63 and will tell you exactly what she thinks of everything whether you ask her or not." "That sounds perfectly adequate," Margaret said. He came down the remaining porch steps and lifted the larger of her two trunks with an ease that spoke to those shoulders being genuinely functional rather than merely decorative, and jerked his chin toward the house. "Welcome to the wrong Winslow place, Miss Brenner," he said. "I'll do my best to make it not entirely a disaster." The house was cooler inside, which was the first point in its favor. The second point in its favor was Della, who turned out to be a short, wide woman with iron-gray hair and the most aggressively competent manner Margaret had ever encountered in any human being, who was producing dinner in the kitchen, and who, upon having Margaret's situation explained to her in about 40 words by Ralph, produced a quantity of sympathy and hot biscuits that went some way toward making the afternoon feel survivable. "Robert Winslow," Della said, putting a plate down in front of Margaret with a thump that communicated several things at once. "That man has always had more correspondence than sense. You drink that coffee and eat something and don't you worry about tonight." "I'm not worried," Margaret said honestly, which made Della look at her with an expression that sharpened from sympathy to interest, which Margaret had also encountered before from people who expected women to be more anxious and were surprised when they were not. Ralph came in from seeing to the horses and washed his hands at the basin by the kitchen door and sat down at the table across from Margaret, and Della put coffee and biscuits in front of him too, and there was a strange and specific domestic quality to the moment that was different from the many thousands of meals Margaret had eaten alone in her rented room above the milliner's shop in Boston. "Do you want me to ride to Robert's tomorrow?" Ralph asked her, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. "Or would you rather handle this yourself?" "I would rather write him a letter," Margaret said, "and then decide from the letter's response what I would like to do next. It seems premature to do anything more dramatic when I haven't established the full situation." Ralph nodded slowly. "That's a measured way to look at it." "What other way would you look at it?" He considered this. "Some people, finding themselves at the wrong ranch on a bad day, would have more feelings about it." "I have feelings," Margaret said. "I just don't lead with them in mixed company." Della, at the stove, made a sound that was clearly the sound of a woman who approved of this approach. Ralph looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite place. It was thoughtful, and something more than thoughtful, the way a person looks when they have been handed something unexpected and are genuinely uncertain what to do with it, which is different from the way a person looks when they already know what to do and are just calculating the timing. "Where did you come from before Boston?" he asked. "I was born in Albany," she said. "We moved to Boston when I was 9. My father was in shipping. Long way from shipping to Texas." "Most distances are a matter of how you count them," Margaret said. "It's long if you count miles. It's shorter if you count what you were moving away from versus what you might be moving toward." Ralph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What were you moving away from?" It was a direct question, and she appreciated direct questions even when they were uncomfortable, which was perhaps one of the things about herself that had made Boston feel like a place she was always slightly out of step with. "A situation that had become very small," she said, "when I had not become small with it." He looked at her for another moment, and the look had changed again, and she couldn't read exactly what it had changed to, which was interesting because she was usually quite good at reading people. "That," he said, "is about the most precisely honest thing anyone has said at this table since I bought this place 4 years ago." Della turned around from the stove with a pot and said, "He talks to the horses mostly." and Ralph gave her a look that she ignored completely, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about the dynamic of this household. That night in the guest room on the second floor, Margaret lay in the clean bed and listened to the sounds of the Texas night, which were different from every other night sound she had ever heard. There were insects she could not name producing a sound like a slow, warm machinery. There was the occasional distant sound of the horses shifting in the corral. There was a breeze that moved the muslin curtain in a way that made it glow faintly in the moonlight, and outside the window, the sky was a darkness she had never seen in any city, deep and absolute, and scattered with more stars than seemed entirely reasonable. She thought about the letter. She thought about Robert Winslow, married in April, expecting a child in November, who had apparently continued his correspondence with her uncle right up until she had gotten on a train without sending any word to correct the misunderstanding. She was irritated about this in a way that was clean and uncomplicated. It was an irresponsible thing to have done, and it had inconvenienced her considerably. But she also found, lying in the dark, that she was not as devastated as she perhaps should have been, which told her something about the degree to which she had been genuinely invested in the prospect of Robert Winslow versus genuinely invested in the idea of forward motion, and the conclusion was clear enough. She thought, too, about the man downstairs, Ralph, with his battered hat and his careful voice and his brown eyes that had looked at her as though she was a problem he was surprised to find interesting. And she stopped that thought before it went anywhere, because she had been in this house for approximately 4 hours and was a practical woman who did not construct feelings out of politeness and dinner biscuits. She went asleep with the stars visible through the curtain and woke to the sound of a rooster and the smell of coffee coming up through the floorboards. The morning was different from the afternoon. The heat had not yet arrived, and the ranch in the early light was remarkable. The limestone house the color of warm honey, the horses moving in the golden corral, the red earth and the blue sky, and the cottonwood trees spinning their silver-green leaves in a morning breeze. Margaret stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at it all and felt something shift slightly in her chest that was adjacent to the feeling of recognizing a place, which she had not experienced before, and therefore did not quite know what to do with. Ralph was already up and working. She could see him at the corral, moving with an economical competence among the horses, adjusting something on a fence rail. He had his hat on and his sleeves rolled up, and he moved with the ease of a person in their own element, and Margaret watched him for a moment before he looked up and saw her. He raised a hand in greeting. She raised her coffee cup back. He came across the yard and stopped at the porch steps, looking up at her. The morning light made the angles of his face different from the night before, sharper and more serious. He needed to shave even more than he had yesterday. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "The stars are extraordinary." Something in his face softened. "First thing I noticed when I came down from Wyoming 4 years ago," he said. "The sky's different here, bigger. You're from Wyoming, born in Laramie, followed my cousin south when he was buying land, thought I'd stay 6 months. He looked around at the ranch with an expression that was dry and fond at once. That was 4 years ago. And you don't regret it, not the staying," he said. "Sometimes I regret specific decisions, but not the staying." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "What specific decisions?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Ask me something easier, Miss Brenner. I find easy questions are rarely worth asking." He laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polite one, surprised out of him, and it transformed his face completely, and Margaret looked quickly out at the horses to avoid having a feeling about it. She wrote her letter to Robert Winslow that morning at the small writing desk in the front room while Ralph went about his work, and she was factual and direct in the letter in a way that she hoped communicated the appropriate amount of displeasure without becoming melodramatic. She explained that she had arrived in Cutter Creek as arranged, that she had been directed to the wrong Winslow property, that she had been received with great kindness by his cousin Ralph, and that she would appreciate a response at his earliest convenience explaining how he intended to address the situation, given that she had traveled a considerable distance on the basis of his correspondence. She sealed the letter and gave it to Ralph, who said he would have it taken into town with his mail order that afternoon, and who then said, with a careful casualness that she recognized as the specific carefulness of a person who has thought about whether to make an offer and decided to make it anyway, that if she was willing to be patient for a few days for the response, she was welcome to stay. "I won't have you sleeping at the Cutter Creek Hotel," he said. "Not when there's a decent room here. And besides," he stopped, and the carefulness shifted towards something more direct. "This wasn't your fault, and you shouldn't be the one inconvenienced by it." Margaret thought about the room and the stars and the coffee that was significantly better than anything she had drunk in the past 3 days. "I would be glad to help with the household while I am here," she said. "I am not a guest who is comfortable sitting idle." "Della will argue with you about it," Ralph said. "I will win," Margaret said. He looked at her for a moment, and the expression she couldn't quite read was back, warmer than before. "Yes," he said, "I expect you will." She did, in fact, win. Della argued for approximately 45 minutes, and then ceded the kitchen garden to Margaret's management, with the air of someone granting a significant concession. And Margaret spent the afternoon weeding and staking the tomato plants and pulling up the withered cucumber vines that had given up the fight against the heat. And when she came in at the end of the afternoon, her hands were dirty and her hair had come half out of its pins, and she felt better than she had in a long time. Ralph came in from the south pasture at supper time and found her at the kitchen table with Della, the two of them in animated disagreement about the best way to dry chilies, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at this scene with an expression that he thought he had kept off his face but which Della saw anyway, because Della saw everything, and which Della filed away with the careful patience of a woman who had been watching Ralph Winslow be stubbornly lonely for 4 years and was very much in favor of developments. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised Margaret by being comfortable. She helped with the kitchen garden every morning, fought an ongoing battle with the well pump that was developing a tendency to stick, and spent several hours each afternoon in the front room with whatever book she could find on Ralph's admittedly modest shelves, which ran heavily toward practical manuals on cattle management and range water rights, but also included, somewhat unexpectedly, a complete set of Washington Irving and a copy of Middlemarch that was dog-eared in multiple places. She asked him about Middlemarch on the third evening, when they were sitting on the porch in the cooling dark and Della had gone to bed early with a headache, and the intimacy of the question surprised her even as she asked it. "A woman in Laramie gave it to me when I left," he said, and his tone had a quality that suggested the woman was a chapter that had closed, which Margaret was aware of noticing more carefully than she perhaps should have. "Did you read it?" "3 times," he said. "That's not the answer I expected. What answer did you expect?" "Something about it being long," she said. He turned to look at her in the dark, and the lamplight coming through the window behind him caught the edge of his face. "It's about people who could have been something to each other if the circumstances had been different," he said, with a directness that matched her own and surprised her. "I found that worth reading more than once." She was quiet for a moment, and the night insects sang their warm machinery song, and a mockingbird began somewhere in the distance running through its repertoire. "That is a surprisingly melancholy reading of that book," she said. "That's what books are for," he said, "seeing things from different angles." She looked out at the dark yard where the horses were quiet shapes in the moonlit corral. "Do you feel that your circumstances are different than what they ought to be?" she asked. It was too personal a question, and she knew it even as she asked it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, 4 years ago, I thought I knew exactly what the shape of my life was going to be. And then things went differently than I thought, and I came down here and I built this place, and it's a good place. It's mine. But there are evenings," he stopped. "There are evenings," she said quietly to help him. "There are evenings when the size of what you're not saying anything to gets loud," he said, That's all. She understood that completely. She understood it the way you understand something that you have felt yourself but never heard named properly before. Yes, she said. I know exactly what you mean. They sat in the dark for a while longer without speaking, which was different from awkward silence, and was instead the silence of two people who have found, somewhat unexpectedly, that they can occupy the same quiet without either of them needing to fill it. Robert Winslow's reply arrived on the fifth day. Ralph brought the letter out from town himself and handed it to Margaret without comment, and she opened it at the kitchen table while Della found sudden reasons to be very busy near the stove. The letter was about what she expected. Robert was apologetic in a way that suggested he had not fully considered the inconvenience he was apologizing for. He was also, reading between the lines, somewhat relieved to discover that she had not arrived at his ranch directly. Given that his wife Clara apparently did not know about the correspondence, and Robert's tone suggested he was very much hoping to keep it that way. He wrote that he was, of course, unable to offer her the arrangement he had described, and that he hoped she would accept his apologies and understand that circumstances had changed. He had, as an afterthought, enclosed $5. Margaret read this letter through twice and then set it on the table and looked at the $5 for a moment. Then she looked up at Ralph, who was leaning against the kitchen doorframe trying to appear as though he was not waiting. He married someone in April, she said, and continued the correspondence with my uncle through March, which means he knew, approximately, when I would be arriving, and did not see fit to send a corrective letter. Ralph's jaw tightened. That was not a decent thing to do. No, Margaret agreed. It was not. She was calm about it, the specific calm of a person who is genuinely angry but has made the decision not to let the anger drive. He has enclosed $5 and his regrets. $5, Ralph repeated, in a tone that said everything about what he thought of that. He seems to believe that resolves the matter. Ralph was very still for a moment, and then he came and sat down across from her at the table, and the expression on his face was no longer careful at all. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "What are my options?" she said, honestly rather than rhetorically. He put both hands flat on the table, and this was a different posture from anything he had used before. It was the posture of a person who has decided to say something and is making sure they are steady before they say it. You could take the stagecoach back to Abilene and the train back to Kansas City or wherever you'd like to go. You could go into Cutter Creek and see if there's any reasonable employment, which I won't pretend is likely because it's a small town and the work available for a woman is limited. Or, he stopped. Or, she said, or you could stay on here as a proper housekeeper with a fair wage and a proper arrangement. I have needed someone in this role for 2 years, and I have been doing very badly at managing it on my own, and Della is not getting younger, and the work is real and the wage would be honest. He held her gaze very steadily. And I would not write to your uncle about it and then marry someone in April without telling you. The last sentence was said with such controlled feeling that it sat in the room for a moment after he had said it. Della was facing the stove, and her shoulders were doing the specific thing that shoulders do when a person is working very hard not to turn around. Margaret looked at Ralph Winslow, at his steady brown eyes and his square jaw and his hands flat on the table, and the fact that in 5 days he had treated her with more consistent respect and consideration than most people managed in 5 months, and she made a decision. I would need to understand the terms clearly, she said. Of course. And I would need a proper written agreement. I'll write it today. And Della would need to remain as well, because, frankly, neither of us should have to manage without her. Della turned around at this with an expression of genuine surprise and then extremely satisfied approval. Della stays as long as she wants to stay, Ralph said firmly. Then, Margaret said, I accept. The months that followed were not romantic in any hurried sense. They were something more careful and more interesting than that. They were the months of two people learning to exist in the same space with increasing honesty, which is a slower thing than romance but builds toward something sturdier. Margaret learned the rhythms of the ranch. She learned which of the horses had which particular personality, and that the big roan named Copper would take a carrot gently from your palm, but would bite the hat off your head if you left it within reach. She learned that Ralph got up before dawn every single day, and was usually in the corral by the time the sun came up, and that he drank 3 cups of coffee in the morning and then nothing until supper, which she thought was a terrible system and said so, and which he changed to 2 cups and a midday meal that she started leaving on the fence post at the south end of the yard for him to find when he came that direction, which he did every day without fail, and which he acknowledged with a raised hand and a nod that somehow conveyed more gratitude than longer speeches might have. He learned that she read late into the evenings and minded it when the lamp oil ran low before she was done, so he made sure the lamp oil was always stocked. He learned that she had a flat, clear singing voice and sang very quietly while she worked in the garden, and that she stopped immediately if she thought anyone could hear her, so he learned to approach from the other direction so she would not stop. He learned that she had strong opinions about the Texas heat that she expressed through a kind of dry, precise commentary that was the funniest thing he had heard in years, and that she had an equally strong capacity for awe at the sunsets, at a hawk hunting over the south pasture, at the nighttime sky, that she was less guarded about expressing, as if beauty bypassed the careful management she applied to most other things. They talked on the porch every evening. This was not an arrangement that had been discussed or decided. It simply developed the way certain things develop, out of habit, and out of the slowly growing recognition that the conversation was the best part of the day. He told her about Wyoming, about growing up in Laramie, about his father who had worked the railroad, about the winter of 1871 that had been so bad the cattle had died standing upright in the snow. He told her about coming south, about spending 3 years building this place from land that was nothing but scrub and red dirt, about the 2 ranch hands who were his employees and had become, without anyone formally deciding it, something closer to friends. A young man named Gideon who was 19 and enthusiastic about everything, and an older man named Davis who had been a Buffalo soldier before mustering out, and who managed the horses with a skill that Ralph said he learned from every day. Margaret listened to these things the way she listened to most things, fully and with genuine attention, storing them carefully, understanding that what a person tells you about their history is what they have decided you should know, and paying equal attention to the shape of what they don't say. She told him about Boston, about the milliner's shop and the rented room, about her father's long decline after the shipping business failed, about the careful, proud way he had continued to dress well and speak optimistically until the very end. She told him about her mother, who had died when Margaret was 16, and about the particular way grief at 16 is different from grief at 24, because at 16, you do not yet know that the world will keep requiring things of you regardless. She did not tell him, yet, about the man in Boston she had been briefly and badly in love with at 21, who had turned out to be exactly the kind of person her direct green eyes had failed to read accurately, and who was one of the things she had been moving away from when she got on the train to Kansas City. That story had a right moment to be told, and she would know when she reached it. In August, something happened that changed the texture of everything. There was a bad storm, the kind the Panhandle produced sometimes without much warning, rolling in from the northwest in the early afternoon with a wall of black cloud that turned the daylight greenish and brought hail and lightning and wind in a combination that was genuinely frightening. Margaret, in the garden when the first warning color appeared in the sky, got herself inside with a speed she had not known she possessed. Ralph and Gideon and Davis got the horses into the barn in a controlled chaos of hooves and urgency. Della battened down every shutter and window with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had lived in Texas for 30 years and did not take summer storms lightly. The storm itself lasted 2 hours. When it cleared, it left behind a downed fence on the east side of the property, and a section of the barn roof that had partially lifted and settled back at an angle that was going to need immediate attention to prevent the next rain from coming through, and a tree down across the back path to the well. Everyone emerged from the house to survey the damage with the specific exhausted relief of people who have been lucky, and Ralph walked the fence line, while Gideon and Davis climbed the barn roof to assess what needed doing, and Della went back inside to make coffee, because she said coffee after a storm was a moral requirement. Margaret walked out to the east fence with Ralph, not because she had been asked to, but because she wanted to see the whole situation, and because the evening after the storm was remarkable. The sky scrubbed clean, the light going golden and extreme at the horizon, the air smelling like rain and earth and something alive. The fallen section of fence was a serious problem. It ran along the edge of the grazing pasture, and a gap there meant cattle could wander toward the road, which was both a loss and a danger. Ralph stood looking at the damage with his arms crossed and his hat in his hand, because the wind had knocked it off twice already and he had given up on it. "How long to fix it?" Margaret asked. "If I get Davis off the barn roof tomorrow morning, 2 days of solid work," he said. He was squinting at the fence with the look of a man doing arithmetic. "The barn can wait 1 more day before it's a real risk. The fence can't." "I can help," she said. He looked at her. "I am entirely serious," she said. "I am stronger than I look, and I can hold posts while they're set. You don't need skill for that, just persistence, and I have plenty of persistence." He looked at her for another moment, and the expression was one she had not seen before, not the careful look, not the thoughtful look, but something more open and warmer and with a quality of wondering in it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know you do." She helped with the fence for 2 days. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done, and every evening she was so tired she could barely lift her arms, and every morning she got up and went back to it, and Ralph worked beside her with a focus and a steadiness that she found, in the way of things she was no longer pretending not to find, genuinely admirable. Gideon fixed the barn roof with Davis's direction. Della cooked enormous quantities of food that appeared to regard the fence repair as a personal challenge to her culinary ambition. On the second evening, when the last post was set and the wire was strung and they were walking back to the house in the last of the light, Ralph said, "I have been trying to manage this place alone for 4 years." "I know," she said. "I am realizing," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing each word exactly, "that I have been doing a kind of math where I added up what I could do alone and called it enough, when actually the correct calculation was different." She looked up at him. He was looking straight ahead at the house, the gold light on the side of his face. "What is the correct calculation?" she asked. He was quiet for 3 steps. Then he said, "I'm not sure I know how to say this without making it sound like a business proposition, which is not how I mean it. I generally prefer directness," she said. "Whatever the form." He stopped walking, and she stopped too, and he turned to look at her in the evening light with an expression that was finally, completely unguarded, no carefulness, no restraint, just the straightforward fact of how he felt, visible on his face as plainly as the horizon. "I don't want you to go, Margaret," he said. "Not when Robert's situation is sorted, not when winter comes and the work is different, not." He stopped and seemed to reconsider the whole approach, and then said, more simply, "I came to this place, and I built something real, and I was proud of it. But you have been here 8 weeks, and I find that I can't imagine it without you in it anymore, and that tells me something I think I should say out loud before I lose my nerve." Margaret Brenner stood in the evening light of the Texas Panhandle on the east side of a fence they had just repaired together and looked at Ralph Winslow, and she understood that this was the moment she had been building toward since she walked through the wrong gate with 2 trunks and a lot of determination. And she also understood that she could either deflect it or meet it, and that she had been moving away from a life of deflection. "You told me," she said, "that Middlemark is about people who could have been something to each other if the circumstances had been different." "Yes." "The circumstances here are not different," she said. "They are exactly what they are. We are exactly where we are." He understood her because he was the kind of person who listened as carefully as she did. "Yes," he said quietly, "we are." "Then I think," she said with the specific precision she used for things that mattered, "that I would like you to say what you are trying to say, without the business language." He took a breath. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some weeks, and I have been extremely unreasonable about it because you came here by accident on your way to my cousin's ranch, and I was not sure it was fair to say so." The word accident sat between them, and Margaret looked at it for a moment. "Ralph," she said, "you believe things happen for a reason. Honestly, I'm not sure." "Neither am I," she said, "but I believe the more interesting question is what you do with what happens. And what I would like to do." She stopped because despite herself her voice had gone slightly unsteady, which was not a thing she was accustomed to, and she waited a moment until it steadied again. "What I would like to do is stay, not as a housekeeper with a written agreement, as something more than that." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was going below the horizon, and the sky was turning rose and gold and the color of embers, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood was singing its complicated borrowed music, and Ralph Winslow reached out and took her hand in both of his, which were calloused and warm and sure. "Margaret Brenner," he said, "you showed up at the wrong gate." "I did," she agreed. "And your name was right, more or less." "It was exactly right," she said. "The gate was wrong." "I am very glad the gate was wrong," he said, and he was smiling now with his whole face, the full smile she had seen only twice before, and both times it had done something to the air in the room. "So am I," she said, and she meant it with everything she had. He did not kiss her then, because he was a man who had been raised to understand that a declaration was not the same as a permission, and because the moment called for something more formal than that. Instead he said, very quietly, "I would like to court you properly, and then, if you are willing, to ask you to marry me properly. And I want to be clear that I mean actually properly, with time and thought and not rushed, because you deserve that and so does this." "You are remarkably good at this," Margaret said, "for a man who claimed to be losing his nerve." "I found it at the last minute," he said. "You should lose your nerve more often," she said. "The result is very good." They walked back to the house hand in hand in the failing light, and Della, who was watching from the kitchen window, turned around and put her hands on her hips and said to the empty kitchen, "Finally," with a satisfaction that was 4 years in the making. The autumn that followed was one of the best periods of Margaret Brenner's life, which she acknowledged to herself with the slightly surprised quality of someone who had not known what to expect from Texas and had found something better. Ralph courted her with a thoroughness that was entirely characteristic. He did not do things partially. He drove her into Cutter Creek on Sundays, which took 4 hours round trip and which he undertook without complaint, and they attended the Methodist church, where half the congregation had opinions about Margaret that were friendly and half had opinions that were curious and a few had opinions that were neither. Because Cutter Creek was a small town, and some of its residents felt that a woman who had arrived alone from the East and was living at the Winslow place was a subject worth speculating about. Ralph had no patience for speculation, and said so, clearly, to at least 2 people that Margaret knew about and probably more that she didn't, which she appreciated without feeling it was necessary, because she had been managing other people's opinions of her since she was 9 years old and had developed very good armor. But the courtship also included things that had nothing to do with managing anyone's opinions. He brought her wildflowers from the south pasture, not with any particular drama about it, just setting them on the kitchen windowsill when he came in for the midday meal, prickly pear blooms and prairie verbena, and once, memorably, a single enormous sunflower that he presented with the slightly sheepish look of a man who had not thought through the gesture until he was already committed to it. She kept every flower until it was completely spent, and then pressed the last of each one in the back of his middle mark. He taught her to ride properly, because she had ridden as a girl but not well, and the lessons took place in the early mornings before the heat arrived and involved a patient, intelligent mare named Birch, who was the most forgiving animal Margaret had ever encountered. The first real lesson ended with Margaret in the dirt, which was both inevitable and undignified, and Ralph on the fence not laughing, which took visible effort, and then coming to help her up and being so genuinely concerned and so badly trying not to smile that she started laughing herself, and that broke something open between them that had been close to the surface for weeks. She rode Birch confidently by October and was attempting the roan copper by November, which Ralph said was ambitious, and which she said was practical because the property was large, and she was tired of walking everywhere. He was right about copper. The horse had opinions, but she was also right, and by November she could ride the full South Pasture circuit on her own, and did so in the early mornings with a sense of freedom she had not known to expect. The question of the injustices of the land came up in October, in a conversation she had not anticipated. Davis, the former Buffalo soldier, was working near the barn when Margaret came back from the South Pasture one morning, and she stopped to talk with him, as she often did, because he was one of the most quietly observant people she had ever met. He had been born in Georgia in 1843, had served in the 10th Cavalry after the war, and had come west as part of the unit they called the Buffalo Soldiers, a name given by the people of the plains out of a respect that the United States government had been considerably slower to extend. He had mustered out 5 years ago and found work with Ralph, who paid him the same wage as Gideon and treated him with the same straightforward respect, which Davis had told Margaret, once, in a moment of directness, was not something you could assume from any employer. Margaret had known, in a general way, the facts of what the Buffalo Soldiers had done and what they had endured, and what the people of the plains had endured before them, and the whole tangled injustice of how the West was being settled and by whose dispossession. Her father had been an abolitionist, and she had grown up with very clear opinions about what people were owed and what they had been denied. She told Davis this, not because she expected it to change anything, but because she thought honesty was generally owed. Davis looked at her for a long moment in the way he looked at everything steady and measuring, and said, "Most people don't say it that plainly. Most people are uncomfortable with plain," she said. "Mr. Winslow's a good man," Davis said, and it was said as a thing he had concluded through evidence and would stand behind. "Not many of them around." "No," Margaret agreed. "He is not common." She told Ralph about this conversation later, and he was quiet about it in the way he was quiet about things he was taking seriously. He said, "Davis deserves better than what this country has given him. I can't fix the whole thing, but I can make sure what I control is fair." "That is the minimum," Margaret said. "Yes," he said without defensiveness. "It is, and I mean to do more than the minimum where I can." She believed him. She had been watching him for months, and she had learned that Ralph Winslow said exactly what he meant to do and then did it, which was a less common quality than people liked to claim. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it in the kitchen, which was probably not what he had planned. She could tell from the way it happened that the specific location was not part of any design, but that he had come in from the pasture on a cold gray morning and found her at the table with her coffee and the month's accounts, which she had taken over managing in September, because she had found a systematic error in how he was tracking feed costs that had been costing him money for 2 years. And the sight of her there, practical and focused, and entirely at home in his kitchen, had apparently undone whatever plan he had made about timing. He sat down across from her, and she looked up from the accounts and saw his face and knew immediately. She put down her pen. "I have been trying," he said, "to plan something more elegant than this." "Don't," she said. "No, not for my sake," she said. "I don't need elegant, I need honest." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his was warm from the fire he had built in the barn to keep the water troughs from freezing, and he said, "Margaret, will you marry me?" It was not even a question, quite. It was something more declarative than that, said with the quiet certainty of a person who has examined the situation from every angle and arrived at a conclusion he is confident in. "Yes," she said with equal certainty. "I will marry you." He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and Della came in from the back room and stopped dead and looked at their faces and said, "Oh good, I was beginning to think I'd have to arrange this myself," which made Ralph say Della in a tone of moderate outrage and made Margaret laugh until her eyes watered. They were married in December in the Cutter Creek Methodist Church. The wedding was small, because they were both practical people who saw no reason to make ceremony into spectacle, but it was not spare of feeling. The church was decorated with cedar boughs because the prairie wildflowers were long done, and Della had made a cake that was frankly excessive in its ambition and perfect in its execution. And Gideon had polished his boots until they were visible from a significant distance, and stood very straight during the ceremony, with the concentrated expression of someone who has been assigned a responsibility and is taking it seriously. Davis stood in the back of the church and watched, and when Margaret caught his eye as she walked back down the aisle on Ralph's arm, he gave her a nod that was precise and sincere, and meant more to her than many more elaborate gestures. Robert Winslow and his wife Clara came from the Double W, which Margaret found she could be gracious about, because the thing that Robert's mistake had set in motion had brought her here, and she could not quite wish it undone. Clara was a quiet, sharp-eyed woman from San Antonio who was very heavily pregnant, and who, after about 10 minutes of conversation with Margaret, said in a tone of frank assessment, "You are much better suited to this family than to Robert," which Margaret took as the highest possible compliment. Robert spent the afternoon looking both apologetic and relieved in equal measure, and Margaret decided to release him from the apology because she found that she genuinely no longer needed it. Ralph's hand was warm in hers throughout the whole afternoon, and when the evening came and the guests had gone and it was just the two of them and the house and the winter stars, he said, "Are you all right?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am, in fact, precisely where I want to be." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they stood in the doorway looking out at the night for a while, the cold air coming in around the edges, the stars enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "We should go in," she said eventually. "We should," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another several minutes. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way Texas Panhandle winters could be hard, not Wyoming hard, Ralph said, but serious in its own right. There were stretches of days when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind came from the north without any obstacle to slow it, and keeping the livestock healthy required constant attention, and the firewood situation was something Margaret became intensely involved in because she found that a poorly stacked woodpile offended her on a practical level that she could not ignore. But the heart of it was also bonding in a way she had not anticipated. The shared effort of maintaining a household through difficulty, the negotiations of space and habit and preference that are the daily substance of a marriage, the discovery that Ralph was almost impossible to irritate in the usual way, but had one or two specific things that made him go very quiet and careful in a way she learned to read as an indication she should ask him what was wrong, which he would then tell her. She, in turn, told him the story of the man in Boston when the opportunity was right, in January when they were snowed in for 3 days, and the conversation eventually went deep enough to reach it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his great qualities, and when she was done he said, he was an idiot, which was so precisely non-elaborate that she laughed. He was, she agreed. His loss was my specific and enormous good fortune, Ralph said, with a sincerity that was not at all self-conscious. That is one way to look at it, she said. It's the right way, he said. In the spring she found out she was expecting. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, which was where all the important things in this household seemed to happen, and his face went through about 5 different things in about 2 seconds, and landed on something that was joy, pure and genuine, with a quality of wonder underneath it that she found affected her considerably more than she had anticipated. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and looked at her as though checking that she was real, and then he said, "Are you all right? How do you feel? What do you need?" "I need you to stop listing things," she said, "and I need you to know that I am perfectly fine and not at all fragile, and I need you to sit down and have your coffee." "Margaret, sit down, Ralph." He sat down, but he kept looking at her across the table with the wonder not yet entirely gone from his face, and she poured him his coffee, and then poured herself the herbal tea that Della had been insisting on since she'd guessed the situation 2 weeks ago before Margaret had confirmed it. And they sat in the spring morning with the window open, and the sound of birds in the cottonwoods and the distant activity of the horses. And it was one of the most ordinary and most extraordinary mornings of Margaret's life. The pregnancy proceeded without particular drama, for which she was grateful. She continued to work in the garden through the summer, with adjustments that Della and Ralph conspired to manage in a way that was so transparent she pretended not to notice in order to let them keep their dignity. She continued to ride Birch through the first 5 months, and then gave it up not because anyone told her to, but because she made her own assessment and decided it was the sensible thing. The reading in the evenings continued. The porch conversations continued. Ralph had taken to reading aloud sometimes in the evenings, which was not something he had done before and which she had discovered when she had a headache one night and he had picked up the Washington Irving without being asked and started reading, and she had closed her eyes and listened to his voice, low and unhurried, and felt the headache recede. She told him once that she had not expected to find this in Texas. "What did you expect to find?" he asked. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "That was the point. I was moving towards something I couldn't see, and—" She looked at him, this man who had given her a home and a purpose and a full life, and who stood in the doorway of their bedroom with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair still in need of cutting and his brown eyes steady and warm on her face, and who had understood the thing she meant by every indirect thing she had ever said to him. "And this is it," she said simply. "The baby came in October. It was a long labor and Della was there, and a woman from Cutter Creek named Mrs. Pryor who served as the town's midwife and who had delivered half the county and had opinions about everything that she expressed at full volume throughout the entire process, which Margaret found both infuriating and grounding. Ralph was outside, which was where men were expected to be during such things, and Gideon reported later that he had worn a path in the yard that was visible for years afterward. The baby was a boy. When Della brought him to Ralph and put him in his arms and said, "You have a son," Ralph stood very still for a moment and then sat down heavily on the porch steps with the baby against his chest and was unable to speak for a full 2 minutes, which Gideon found alarming and Davis found entirely understandable. They named him James, after Margaret's father. Ralph carried James everywhere for the first 3 days in a way that suggested he had not fully processed that the baby would continue to exist when not actively being held, and Margaret, from her bed where Della was doing the work of ensuring she recovered properly, watched this through the doorway with a feeling in her chest that was too large and too warm to have a proper name. "You are going to spoil him," she said. "Absolutely," Ralph agreed, not looking up from James's face. "That was meant to be a caution." "I heard it as a promise," he said. She laughed, which hurt slightly, and Ralph looked up immediately with concern, and she waved him off, and James, at the sound of her laugh, turned his tiny new head toward the sound, and Ralph made an expression that she was fairly sure she would remember for the rest of her life. The years that followed built upon each other with the specific richness of a life that is being fully lived rather than managed from a distance. Gideon grew up in the way that 19-year-olds do when they are in a good situation, steadier, more skilled, eventually finding a wife of his own, a girl from Cutter Creek named Annie who had her mother's practicality and her father's humor, and who fit into the expanded rhythm of the Winslow place as naturally as if she had always been there. Davis eventually established a small stake of his own, Land Ralph helped him secure through a combination of practical assistance and the kind of advocacy that was quiet and steady and consistent. And though he did not live on the Winslow property, he was near enough to be a constant and valued presence. Della, despite her age and her frequently stated opinion that she was exhausted, showed no signs of slowing down, and managed the kitchen with a continued iron competence that Margaret had long since stopped arguing with about anything except the chili drying, about which they maintained an affectionate ongoing disagreement that had become something of a tradition. James grew up with horses and space, and the particular education of a mother who believed in books and a father who believed in work, and the combination of the two, which gave him a quality at 10 years old that was already distinctly and irreducibly his own. He had Ralph's eyes and Margaret's directness and a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, warm and sudden and generous. When James was 4, they had a second child, a daughter they named Eleanor, after Ralph's mother, who had died when he was 17, and whom he did not speak of often but spoke of carefully. Eleanor arrived with considerably less drama than James had managed, possibly because Mrs. Pryor had developed an extremely efficient system, and grew into a child so self-possessed and observant that Margaret recognized her own early self in her with a mixture of recognition and amusement. The ranch grew in those years, not dramatically, not through any speculative ambition, but through the steady accumulation of good decisions and consistent work. Ralph bought the adjacent section of land in 1882, which meant the south pasture doubled, and the fence work that went with it was considerable. But the grazing was better, and the extra space allowed them to run more cattle without the land suffering for it. Margaret, by this point, managed the ranch accounts with a system she had developed and refined over 5 years, and which kept them solvent through 2 dry summers and a market dip that made a lot of other operations in the county very uncomfortable. There were difficult things too, because life is not consistent in its difficulty any more than in its ease. The drought of 1883 was real and hard, and required decisions about the herd that were painful in the specific way that practical necessities can be painful when they involve living things. There was a year when Gideon got sick in the way that sometimes happened in those years with illnesses that did not always have names, and the whole household held its breath for a month until he came back to himself, pale and thinner but present and determined. There was a conflict with a neighboring rancher over water rights that went on for 8 months and required 2 lawyers and a visit to the county seat, and produced an outcome that was reasonable but not perfect, which was, Ralph said, the usual nature of reasonable outcomes. Through all of it, the porch in the evenings. Through all of it, the conversations that went wherever they needed to go. Through all of it, the specific and particular reliability of being understood by the person you have chosen to be understood by. Margaret, standing in the kitchen garden in the autumn of 1885, 7 years after the afternoon she had walked through the wrong gate with 2 trunks, and an argument about the best way to stake tomatoes waiting in her, looked up at the sound of Ralph coming across the yard from the barn, and felt the feeling she had felt 10,000 times and still felt newly each time, the recognition. The specific warmth of seeing this person, this man who had offered her a guest room and an honest wage, and who had held her hand across a kitchen table, and who had cried, privately and without embarrassment, when James was born, and who read Washington Irving out loud by lamplight, and who still needed his hair cut, and who had never once in 7 years said a single thing he did not mean. He came to the garden gate and leaned on it, looking at her. James was somewhere behind him, probably at the corral. Eleanor was in the house with Della, learning something about baking that Della was apparently determined to teach her despite Eleanor's stated preference for the horses over the kitchen. "You look like you're thinking about something," Ralph said. "I'm always thinking about something," she said. "Something specific." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going golden the way it went golden in September, turning everything warm and slightly unreal, the way the Texas light did when it decided to be extraordinary. "I was thinking," she said, "about a day in June of 1878. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific day." "It was a very specific day," she said. He came through the garden gate and stood beside her, and she leaned against him the way she had learned to lean against him, and his arm came around her shoulders with the easy surety of something done 10,000 times. "I showed up to the wrong ranch," she said. "You did," he agreed. "With the right name." "Close enough," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, the same smile that still transformed his face, the same one that still did something to the air around them. She turned her face up to look at him. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Hector had read the roads right and dropped me at Robert's gate?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Yes," he said. "I think about it the way you think about things you're glad didn't happen, which is a different way from regret." "Robert and Clara are happy," she said. They were, in fact, they had 3 children now and had added a wing to the double W, and Robert had grown up considerably in the intervening years. "They are," he said. "And we are." She looked out at the garden, at the tomatoes she had staked, at the chilies drying in the way she preferred rather than the way Della preferred, at the kitchen window where she could see a small shadow that was a leaner, and out past the garden to the yard and the barn and the corral where the horses moved in the golden afternoon, and the cottonwood trees that had grown tall in 7 years, and the red earth road that ran past the gate that had the wrong name and had given her everything. "We are," she said. Ralph pressed his lips to her hair and said nothing else, because nothing else was necessary. Later that evening, after James was in bed and Alina had fallen asleep mid-sentence in the way she often did, all at once and completely, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her tea and the accounts, and Ralph sat across from her with his coffee, still 2 cups in the morning, which she had given up arguing about years ago, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who have filled enough silences together that silence itself has become a kind of conversation. "Davis came by this afternoon," Ralph said, "while you were in the garden. I saw him at the gate," she said. "He looked well." "He's adding a room to his house," Ralph said. He said it with a quality of satisfaction that was private and warm, the satisfaction of knowing that something is right. "Good," she said with the same quality. She looked down at the accounts and then looked up at him, and the lamplight was warm on both of them, and the night outside was deep and full of stars that she had fallen asleep to for 7 years and never tired of. "I'm going to need more lamp oil soon," she said. "I'll get it tomorrow," he said, without looking up from wherever his thoughts were. She looked at him for a moment, this man, her husband, the man at the wrong gate with the right name, and felt the fullness of it settle through her the way warmth settles when you come in from the cold, complete and sure and entirely without remainder. "Ralph," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, and she meant all of it, the guest room, the honest wage, the written agreement, the hand across the kitchen table, the wildflowers on the windowsill, the reading aloud, James's face, Alina's laugh, the fence they had fixed together, every single morning in Texas with the sky going gold, all 7 years of being known. He looked at her with the expression that was still the one she could not fully read, the warm, wondering one, and said, "For what exactly?" "For deciding the name was close enough," she said. He smiled, the real one, the full one, and said, "It was the easiest decision I ever made." Outside, the stars did their enormous, indifferent, beautiful work over the Winslow ranch, and inside the lamplight held, and the cottonwood trees that had been young when Margaret arrived were tall now and steady and deeply rooted, the way things are when they have had enough time and enough care to grow into what they were always meant to be. James grew into a young man who had his father's love of horses and his mother's love of books, and who showed signs, by the time he was 12, of being a better rider than either of his parents, a fact that Ralph announced with pride every chance he got, and Margaret received with the mixture of amusement and genuine pleasure she had developed for his more enthusiastic parenting moments. Alina, true to her early character, developed a particular talent for mathematics that Margaret discovered when she found Alina at 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table working her way through the accounts with a pencil and a focused expression, correcting a small error that Margaret had made in the previous month's tallying. "This column is off," Alina said without looking up. "I know," Margaret said. "I was going to correct it." "I already did," Alina said. Margaret looked at Ralph over Alina's head, and he looked back at her, and the look they exchanged contained approximately 40 separate things, most of them hilarious, and neither of them said any of them out loud because Alina was 9 and did not yet need to know that she was already funnier than most adults. The end of the decade brought changes to the Panhandle, as it brought changes to all of the West. The railroad extending, the towns growing, the vast open range being cut by wire fences as more settlers arrived, and the old ways of managing cattle across open land gave way to something more bounded. Ralph navigated these changes with the same steadiness he brought to everything, adapting where he needed to without losing what was essentially his. He bought a new bull in 1887 from a rancher in Amarillo, a transaction that required 3 days of negotiation, and which Ralph described to Margaret in more detail than was strictly necessary, but which she followed with genuine interest because she had learned over 9 years that the specifics of the cattle operation were genuinely interesting, and that she had merely not known to find them so before she arrived in Texas. The town of Cutter Creek grew, in those years, into something approaching a real town. A proper school was established in 1886, which meant James and Alina could attend 5 days a week rather than the 3 they had managed before with the traveling teacher. Margaret served on the school board, which was a position she had been asked to take, and had accepted with the condition that she would actually exercise her opinions on the board rather than serving decoratively, which the other board members had agreed to with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and which she held them to consistently. She was, in these years, genuinely happy. Not the small-room happiness of managed expectations, not the careful happiness of someone who has decided to be content with what is available, but the full, present, specific happiness of a person who has found the life that fits them and is living it all the way to the edges. She knew this about herself, knew it the way she knew the shape of the house and the sound of the horses and the smell of the kitchen in the morning, and she was grateful for it in a way that was not anxious but was deep and consistent and daily. In 1888, 10 years after she had walked through the wrong gate, she stood on the porch of the limestone house on a June morning, the same June quality of light, the same red earth, the cottonwoods full and tall and turning in a morning breeze, and thought about the girl who had arrived with 2 trunks and a letter about a man named Robert. She thought about Boston and the small room and the milliner's shop. She thought about her father in his careful good clothes and her mother who had left too early and her uncle who had written a letter that was intended to help and had, through its spectacular misdirection, helped in a way no one had planned. She thought about Hector, the wagon driver, and his opinions about fence posts, and the way he had pointed at this gate and said, "That's the Winslow place," without specifying which one. She owed Hector, she thought, a debt she could never repay. The door opened behind her and Ralph came out with 2 cups of coffee, because he had recently acquired the habit of making her coffee in the morning, which she accepted every time it was offered, and which she knew he knew she noticed and neither of them talked about because some things are expressed better in the doing than in the discussing. He handed her the coffee and stood beside her on the porch, and they looked out at the morning together. 10 years, she said. "I know," he said. "Do you know what I was thinking about?" "Hector," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard with his coffee cup in both hands and the morning light on his face, and he was smiling at something which she suspected was the private joke of the thing. "How did you know?" "Because it's June," he said, "and because you get a specific look in June." "I have a June look." "You have about 14 different looks," he said. "I have catalogued most of them." She looked at him with a warmth that she did not bother to manage or qualify. "I was thinking," she said, "about the ways in which accidents are sometimes the least accidental things." He turned to look at her, the full look, the one that still reached her after 10 years. "Yes," he said, "I think about that too. Often. Every time I look at you," he said, simply and without any self-consciousness about the simplicity. "Every time I look at the kids. Every time Davis comes through the gate or Gideon comes across the yard. Every time you win an argument with Della about the chilies." He paused. "The chili argument especially." She laughed, and James appeared around the corner of the house with the timing of a person who has been listening for the sound of his mother's laugh in the way that children do when they are calculating the likelihood of breakfast. And he was tall now, 13, and growing fast with his father's coloring and his mother's direct eyes. "Is there coffee?" he asked. "There is not coffee for 13-year-olds, Margaret said. "There might be biscuits," Ralph said. James went inside. Alina appeared approximately 30 seconds later, smaller and more deliberate than her brother, and said, without preamble, "The south pasture fence has a post that's loose. I saw it yesterday." "Which section?" Ralph said. Alina described the location with a precision that was genuinely impressive for someone of 10, and Ralph said he would look at it before noon, and Alina nodded with the satisfied air of a task completed and went back inside, and Ralph and Margaret looked at each other. "She's going to run this place someday," Ralph said. "She would run it better than we do," Margaret said. "Almost certainly," he agreed. They stood on the porch a while longer, in the good June morning, with the children inside, and the horses in the corral and the cottonwoods turning their silver-green leaves in the breeze, and the whole long future of the place arrayed before them in the particular way that futures look when you have built something that will last. There was the matter of the accounts to return to. There was the loose fence post that needed attention before it became a gap. There was a letter from Robert and Clara, who were expecting again, and who had written to ask if James might come to the Double W for a week in July, an invitation James had expressed enthusiasm about, and which would need to be properly arranged. There was Della, who had announced last week that she was finally, at 68, considering retiring to her sister's house in Abilene, which was going to require a conversation, and an adjustment that no one in the household was looking forward to, but which would be navigated, as everything was, with the care and the steadiness that had become the character of this place. There was all of that. And there was this morning first, and the coffee, and the man beside her, and the Texas light laying itself across everything with its particular extravagant generosity. "Thank you," Ralph said quietly. She looked at him. "For what?" "For staying," he said. "After that first night, for not just getting back on the road the next morning." She considered this. "The alternative," she said, "was the Cutter Creek Hotel." "There was that," he agreed. "And," she said, "your guest room was clean. And Della's biscuits were extraordinary, and you had a copy of Middlemarch that had been read 3 times. She looked at him. What sensible woman would have left? He looked back at her with everything in his face that had always been there, and that she had spent 10 years learning to trust, the steadiness, the warmth, the slightly wondering quality that told her she had not yet become ordinary to him, which was the thing she had not known to hope for, and which turned out to be the thing that mattered most. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back, and meant it in the way that 10 years of shared life gives you to mean things completely, and with full knowledge of what the word contains. The morning continued to be beautiful. The loose fence post would be seen to. The accounts would be balanced. The letter to Robert would be answered. Della's retirement would be navigated with all the grace they could manage. James would go to the Double W in July and come back talking about nothing but Robert's horses for a month. Alina would find 3 more errors in the accounts, which she would correct without comment and with enormous quiet satisfaction. And in the evenings, the porch, and the conversations, and the stars, enormous and impractical and magnificent, over the Winslow ranch, where a woman with a suitcase and the right name had walked through the wrong gate and found the thing she had been moving toward without knowing it, which was not a man or a ranch or a Texas sky, though it was all of those things, but was specifically and irreducibly this. A life that was entirely her own, fully inhabited, with someone beside her who saw her completely and was glad of everything he saw. That was the whole of it. That was more than enough.